We are much more closely related to, for example, a salmon than a salmon is to a shark.
When the first sharks appeared on Earth, it was a very empty planet. In fact, sharks predate every land animal and evolved along with the very earliest fish. But how did this group rise to become among the most successful animals on Earth?
This is a big tooth.
How did it survive the rise of the dinosaurs?
I think Hybodus probably kept its head down.
The two mass extinctions, which each wiped out 80% of all life on Earth.
The end Permian extinction is vastly more severe than that that occurred at the end Cretaceous that wiped out dinosaurs.
And why have their numbers now plummeted in the last 15 years by 80%?
I don't think in the whole history of man's abuse of animals we've ever killed quite so many of one species. It's just a hugely cruel process in many cases as well. And it really does need bringing to light, because we have nothing to be proud of with regard to sharks at all.
This is our planet, 400 million years ago. The Devonian Age. The land is barren, empty but for the few fern-like plants, struggling to gain a foothold at the water's edge. But in the water, armour-plated creatures, barely recognisable as fish, are already filling the oceans. Arandaspis is one of the most primitive.
They would have been very heavy for their size. They had no paired fins that give a fish stability. They weren't very flexible, and above all, they didn't have true jaws, so they weren't capable of feeding on anything that needed to be bitten or chewed.
But now there was something else in the water. Faster, sleeker, more manoeuvrable. The jawless armour-plated fish found themselves suddenly outclassed. Just how and where sharks first appeared is a mystery. Without armoured skeletons, they left very little fossil evidence. What is clear is that they brought with them an innovation that changed the course of life on Earth. Because along with the first sharks came the first jaws, and with them, teeth. Millions of teeth.
Through their life, they continuously produce huge numbers of teeth, which are produced on a sort of conveyor belt, and they move from the back of the jaw through to the front. When they've finished being used, they fall out, so that through the lifetime of any particular shark, they might generate many thousands of teeth, which is thousands of potential fossils.
In some places, such as here in the phosphate mines of Morocco, fossil shark teeth appear in startling numbers. It's estimated that up to 1% of the rock here is made up of nothing else, and the excavations feed an industry catering for collectors and jewellery makers, as well as the odd paleontologist. The appearance of jaws was a pivotal moment. Without it, the complex interaction of predator and prey, which has defined evolution ever since, would simply not exist.
The appearance of jaws and proper teeth anchored in the jaws was an essential evolutionary invention that pretty much changed the course of evolution, I would say. But in saying that, it's difficult to say what other way it could have gone because we have no evidence for that. But definitely it was a great advantage over all those other creatures who did not have those jaws.
Well, the evolution of jaws allowed the vertebrates to radiate into two major groups. One of these is the group that gave rise to the bony fish, and from those onto the reptiles and the amphibians and to us. And the other group it gave rise to is the group that ended up as the sharks and the rays and the chimeras.
The split between sharks and the rest of the fish occurred so early in history that they are now only distantly related to anything else on Earth.
If we call a fish anything that's fish-shaped and anything that's evolved from it, it means that essentially we're bony fish because we're the direct descendants of these early bony fish. So in fact we're much more closely related to, for example, a salmon than a salmon is to a shark.
At that very beginning where the jawed vertebrates arise, at that very beginning it is difficult to tell apart the various groups. To identify a fossil shark as such, we would have to have a pretty complete skeleton. The further back we go, we don't find those complete remains. We find teeth predominantly, dermal skin elements and fin spines.
One early shark did make it into the fossil record. Cladosalaki.
There are sharks considerably earlier than Cladosalaki. The reason it's so important is it's the earliest shark where we have very well preserved whole skeletons, some of them even with the impressions of skin and soft tissues.
Well, Cladosalaki was a high-tech predator for the time it was alive compared to the other vertebrates and many other creatures that were around. Cladosalaki was highly capable of developing good speed to catch its prey and to bite good chunks out of it.
The body shape of these very early sharks is very similar to that of modern ones. There are quite a lot of differences in the skeleton and the way the body shape actually works. But if you saw one swimming around today, you'd certainly recognize it as a shark.
But the early sharks did not have it all their own way.
The sharks had a terribly difficult life. They were not the only group that had developed this evolutionary advantage with jaws and proper teeth. Of course, the bony fishes were around, and the bony fishes developed a great diversity.
By the end of the Devonian, the armoured fish were back.
One could say that was an evolutionary arms race, almost, between the sharks and other groups of vertebrates that developed from there on. Predominantly, at the beginning, it was of course the fishes, but from the fishes then other groups developed soon after.
Dunkleosteus was huge, armour-plated, bigger by far than any of the sharks, and with its own shearing, slicing jaws.
Maybe up to 8 meters or so in length, with a huge armoured head region and jaws lined with sharpened bony plates. There was really very little that this thing couldn't have eaten if it had wanted to.
But the chemistry of the earth was changing. On land, the first forests began to grow, claiming the low-lying areas as murky swamps, and spreading outward across the empty world. But these are not trees. In fact, they're related to horsetails, ferns and club mosses. And some are up to 40 meters tall. The new plants pumped oxygen into the atmosphere and laid down thick layers of nutrient-rich soil. The whole balance of life on Earth shifted.
Suddenly there was large amounts of new environments opening up on land, and all the animals that were capable of moving onto land and taking advantage of this did.
In the water, the slow, heavy armoured fish gave way to faster, more active creatures, and in response their predators, the sharks, exploded into a huge variety of strange new shapes.
As you go from the Devonian period into the succeeding Carboniferous, there certainly is this apparent great increase in the diversity of sharks and shark-like fishes in the fossil record.
I'm thinking particularly of coral reefs. Coral reefs had been around since Devonian times, but the complexity of the interactions between corals, for example, meant to say that there was a much greater diversity of habitat. And of course, you've got smaller fish and invertebrates exploiting some of the nooks and crannies in these places, and chondrichthyans, sharks and their allies responded in kind to be rather more specific in the way that they caught and processed their food.
This proliferation was so widespread, it's led researchers to describe this time as the golden age of sharks.
The Carboniferous in particular is usually referred to as a golden age of shark. We can find a lot of very different shark teeth in the fossil record, and there's also a great diversity of very weird sharks that produced a lot of odd features.
The shark remains, or at least in the broadest possible sense, the chondrichthyans, the cartilaginous fishes, which include allies of sharks as well, they seem to dominate the seas of the Carboniferous.
Many sharks abandoned the oceans altogether and began to hunt in the murky waters of the swamps and flooded forests.
Within the Carboniferous, the sharks were certainly not just restricted to the seas, and in fact we probably know of more freshwater sharks than we do of marine ones.
The most successful freshwater sharks were the xenocanths. Their eel-like bodies were ideal for navigating the choked waterways, and growing to over 3 meters in length, they quickly made the swampland their own.
They had a very peculiar spine on the back of the skull, and teeth with a very distinctive two-cusped arrangement, two large cusps like that, sometimes with a smaller one in the middle, and they were the larger predators of freshwater. You could easily imagine them inhabiting fairly murky waters.
Probably fairly similar to a number of the very big catfish that you get in tropical rivers and swamps today. Most of the predators living in these environments would have just waited amongst all the fallen logs and decaying plant matter for something edible to swim within range, and then would launch forward, and having these very clearly hooked teeth, once they've bitten onto the fish or amphibian that they're feeding on, its chance of escape was probably virtually zero.
Stranger still was Lystracanthus.
The scale-like remains of this creature, Lystracanthus, looked like feathers rather, and it's difficult to imagine a feather-like structure on a fish swimming in the water. Unfortunately, all we have is just bunches of these scales preserved in the fossil record. There are never any teeth or skeletal elements, so we haven't got a clue what this shark looked like when it was alive.
The hair wasn't soft and flexible like that of a mammal. It was formed by hair or tuft-shaped scales, which would have been rigid.
Lystracanthus may have used these rigid scales as a form of protection, in the same way that a porcupine uses its spines.
It would have been able to swim forwards and work its way through the vegetation very well with these backward pointing little spines or hairs. But on the other hand, it would have been very difficult for a predator catching hold of one to be able to extract it.
Other sharks developed what scientists have only been able to interpret as bizarre sexual adaptations. This is Stethecanthus. The bony growths on its back and the top of its head are both covered in modified teeth.
We see a whole range of weird-looking sharks that developed strange hooks or brushes on top of their back, and nobody really knows what they were good for. There are all sorts of interpretations out there. Symbol of virility, used in courtship, used in all sorts of sexual interaction maybe, or also as a sensor maybe, hooked up with detection for prey. Who knows? We have no idea.
There's been considerable debate as to what these dorsal structures of Stethecanthus and its relatives were for, but they appear to be only present on males, so they may have been used for males fighting amongst themselves for females, or used for either impressing a female or for some way gripping onto the female during the mating process.
Stethecanthus remains have been found in both salt and fresh water, and it's possible that they may have migrated, just as salmon do today.
The competition for females is intense, and sharks have an amazing sense of smell, of course, and are able to track down not just prey, but females over large distances. And so, yes, you can imagine a sort of a congress of males competing for the attentions of fewer females.
But the most surprising of the early shark fossils was this spiral, the size of a dinner plate, first discovered in Russia in 1899. Initially, it was identified as an ammonite shell, but the truth was that this was part of a shark, which would have grown to over 10 feet in length.
Probably the most mysterious and poorly understood fossil of any shark-like fish is the remains of Helicoprion. And the main fossils of this that are known consist of a spiral which has lots of teeth on the outside of the spiral whorl. And the affinities of this have been very poorly understood, and there have been a number of rather bizarre suggestions over the years.
Opinions differ about how Helicoprion wore its spectacular whorl of teeth, but it's thought to have grown from the creature's bottom jaw, like a huge circular saw.
The very earliest, smallest teeth would be in the centre of the spiral, and it seems to have grown in a pattern out of the centre of the lower jaw.
One suggestion is that it's been used as a structure to ram prey items and disable them, allowing the shark to then feed on immobilized prey.
But the age of sharks was not to last. This huge diversity created highly specialized creatures, and when times are good, the specialists flourish. But at the end of the Permian Age, 251 million years ago, times were not good. In fact, times were very bad indeed.
At the end of the Permian, there is a major extinction event, probably the biggest extinction event that's occurred since the first appearance of life on the planet. The end Permian extinction is vastly more severe than that that occurred at the end Cretaceous that wiped out dinosaurs, among many other things, with a far smaller proportion of survivors.
The Permian extinction was so long ago that almost all trace of what actually happened has been wiped from the geological record by the movement of continents. But clues remain. What is known is that at the same time that species were dying out all over the globe, the planet itself was being torn apart.
It's not a large central volcano, it's more like the interior of an entire continent is suddenly overtaken by a very large volcanic event. The volume of lava which came out of the ground was very, very much larger than anything we've ever seen in human history. One of the things which the lavas would produce is a lot of gas, and the immediate connection you could make with extinction is that the gas pollutes effectively the climate on a global scale, changing the global temperature substantially over a relatively short space of time.
As the Earth renewed itself, reshaping its surface, greenhouse gases choked the atmosphere.
Currently, if you look at all the volcanoes around the world which are erupting, and you actually try to work out how much carbon dioxide, for example, is coming out from volcanoes, it probably is less than man is producing, but not by a very significant amount. It would be possible that during times of much more vigorous volcanic activity, which we know have taken place on the Earth, and some of which definitely coincide with mass extinctions, then the total amount of gas coming out would be very much enhanced, much larger.
Recent studies have suggested that the destruction may have been initiated by a comet or meteor slamming into what is now Siberia.
What we're suggesting is that in the case of the Siberian traps, these are located with, if you like, an epicenter or a ground zero where they should be thickest, at the point where a meteorite or a comet slammed into the Earth, punctured through the Earth's crust, and then caused volcanism to occur in the same place. So that what we now see is not evidence for an impact crater, but the impact crater has been drowned by being filled with lots of lava, which went on to overflow the edges of that crater or hypothetical crater and create what we now see as a very large pile of lavas called the Siberian traps.
Whether there was a meteor strike is uncertain, but something triggered the most powerful volcanic eruption in the history of the planet.
You have the double effect of both an impact which overloads the climate or the Earth system with debris and perhaps causes nuclear winter, followed by volcanism, which can cause sustained damage to the atmosphere in terms of gas which is released from the volcanic event as well. So that effectively what you have is a double whammy in classic speak. You have an impact event closely associated with a volcanic event, and perhaps this double loading mechanism is actually what is too stressful for species to survive, and that causes a mass extinction.
But the extinctions were not instant. Siberia burned for hundreds of thousands of years, and the fossils of this time are rare. Some scientists even doubt that global mass extinction ever actually happened.
In fact, at that boundary 250 million years ago, one would say life nearly died. There was a great effect on almost all groups alive at that time. But if we look at this problem from some closer distance and try and find out what groups can we actually trace across the boundary, then we find out that our data is not that great. Yes, it is true, they're completely different creatures in the Paleozoic from the Mesozoic, but it is also true that many creatures that we believed went extinct across the boundary are all of a sudden found a little later in the early Triassic.
One way or another, by the Triassic period, 240 million years ago, the Earth was a very different place. 95% of life had been replaced. Some sharks, in fact a surprising number, survived the Permian extinction, but in evolutionary terms, the sharks were slipping behind.
There have been big changes taking place in the bony fish, and they're diversifying very rapidly. And in fact, they're taking over some of the niches that traditionally were held by the sharks in the Carboniferous. So that required diversification amongst the sharks in response.
Well, as we go through the Triassic period, there's a gradual changeover with the last of the survivors of the end Permian extinction gradually fade out, including amongst these were the last of the xenocanths. One group that did get through were the hybodont sharks, which were much more closely related to the sharks and rays around today. And by the end of the Triassic, these have become by far the dominant group, both in the seas and in freshwater conditions. The hybodonts have a rather basic body plan. All hybodonts seem to have had a body that was roughly the same shape, but their teeth are very, very diverse. Some were tall, slender points for gripping slippery prey. Some had cutting edges for slicing through larger prey items. Some were blunt and would have been there for crushing mollusks and other hard-shelled prey.
The modern fish were faster and more agile, and the world was now dominated by a new group of reptiles, the dinosaurs.
Through the Triassic period, there's also a huge radiation among the few reptiles that had managed to get through the end Permian extinction. By the time you get to the end of the Triassic and into the Jurassic period, there were a wide range of marine reptiles, many of which were much larger and probably much faster than any of the hybodont sharks.
There was obviously quite a complex food chain, and many of the predators might have been fairly opportunistic, taking everything they could get hold of in the water column.
Ichthyosaurs, dolphin-like in shape but unrelated. Their speed combined with a greater intelligence than the fish mean that they have the potential to hunt in organised packs.
Ichthyosaurs were very highly streamlined and in their general shape not unlike modern dolphins. So they would have presumably fed in a relatively similar way.
Circling the fish, the ichthyosaurs cut off their escape. In response, the fish form a defensive shoal, hoping to confuse their attackers. Working together, the ichthyosaurs corral the fish into tighter and tighter shoals, forcing them together and up towards the surface. Here, they are exposed to another threat, plesiosaurs, hanging near the surface. Their long necks are not flexible enough to bend and snake through the shoal. Instead, they feed like birds, dipping down from above to snatch at the confused fish. With their prey pinned against the surface, the ichthyosaurs' behaviour changes. They take turns to dive through the panicked shoal again and again. Normally unable to attack the fast-moving shoals, the hybodont sharks have learned to respond to the appearance of ichthyosaurs. They have begun to gather beneath the shoal. With the fish so tightly packed and driven on by the reptiles, the sharks now have a chance to grab at isolated or stunned fish as they fall from the bait ball, or lunge at the centre in the hope of grabbing disorientated prey.
You could imagine the hybodonts perhaps around the margins of the shoal catching the loose cannons that come out from the centre and feeding off those that sort of came their way.
Suddenly, the ichthyosaurs scatter. Their sharp senses have detected something in the water. But feeding sharks are oblivious to danger.
The ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, very effective predators though they were certainly not the top of the food chain in the mid to late Jurassic seas. During the early part of the Jurassic, another group of plesiosaurs had evolved not to have a longer and longer neck and smaller head, but the neck had become gradually shortened and the head had become larger and more powerfully built, until you end up with what's recognised as a pliosaur. And these were probably the big top predators of the time. I can't imagine a large pliosaur being particularly interested in picking off small fish, but around the small fish would be the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs and the sharks that had already been feeding on them, and these would provide a very good hunting opportunity for a large pliosaur.
The most fearsome of the pliosaurs measured over 20 metres, the size of a sperm whale, and a lower jaw of over 3 metres in length has been recorded. This would make the pliosaurs among the largest carnivores ever to have lived. Unable to flee to the safety of the seabed or in towards shore, the shark is forced out into open ocean. The pliosaur is built for distance. Its streamlined shape and efficient method of swimming mean it can keep up this pace from one side of the ocean to the other. The hybodon shark, on the other hand, spends its time in the shallows. It has neither the body shape nor the power to swim any great distance. Sooner or later, its strength will fail.
They certainly weren't built for speed, they're not built for endurance swimming out in open water, and a hybodont trapped out in the open by a large predator had only one means of defence, and that was to rely on the large barbed spines sticking out in front of the two fins on its back.
The hybodonts may have looked much like modern sharks, but it was another group of tiny sharks, too small to be threatened by the reptiles, which would eventually give rise to the sharks we know today.
It's a bit like the mammals that hung out in the shadow of the dinosaurs for millions and millions of years. The little modern sharks were in the mid-Jurassic and really did very, very little for tens of millions of years, until the dominance of Hybodus, whose habitat was probably slipping away a bit, and perhaps some of the marine reptiles, was reduced, and then they came in and filled up some of the ecological niches. One of the biggest changes that took place in the Mesozoic was right towards the end of the Jurassic, when a group of sharks, or at least one particular shark, a bottom-feeding, a carpet shark-like thing, evolved rather longer teeth and a decent tail, which allowed it to get off the ground, and it actually went from being a bottom dweller to a mid-water dweller. And a mid-water dweller with decent teeth is a decent predator. And this is one probability, one scenario for the development of the lamniforms, a group that contains the threshers, the great white, the makos, and all the and sand sharks. And from this probable single ancestor evolved most of the sharks, most of the big ocean-going, the global distributed sharks that we have now. They appear at the beginning of the Cretaceous with just 2 or 3 different species, and very, very rapidly change until they become the dominant predator in the sea.
The Neoselacians, or modern sharks, were fast, strong and agile, and by the end of the Cretaceous they had given rise to the nurse sharks, sand sharks, mackerel sharks and tiger sharks, which have remained virtually unchanged ever since. Indeed, many of the sharks in our oceans today evolved to survive in the age of the dinosaurs. An offshoot of this group also gave rise to another family of sharks, the rays.
What the most primitive shark looked like, we can't possibly tell, but it was probably sort of halfway between a shark and a ray. This is a dried guitar fish. Lives in tropical oceans. It's a ray. It's a fairly advanced ray. and its pectoral fins, the fins you see sticking out the sort of shoulder area of a shark, have been incorporated into its head to give a large flat area which, when it moves its tail around, it will glide along the surface, probably using its nose to detect electrical disturbances caused by small scurrying crabs or wriggling worms.
65 million years ago, the age of the dinosaurs ended in a blinding flash. The asteroid, which ploughed into Mexico, was 10 kilometres across, but it was not the fireball it created, or the tsunamis it sent around the globe which caused the extinctions.
Liberated from that impact into the atmosphere would have been very large amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, and the impact was so large that these materials would have been distributed completely around the Earth. They wouldn't have been restricted to the northern or the southern hemisphere. They would have been completely global in their extent.
Some creatures could even have survived the months of darkness. It was on a microscopic level that the meteor inflicted its most devastating blow. These are coccoliths, microscopic plants floating in their trillions in every ocean. They are the very base of the food chain in the seas, turning sunlight into organic matter.
The extinguishing of those plankton in the oceans could well have caused a very rapid cascading extinction event at all trophic levels. So from the sort of the zooplankton that feed on the phytoplankton, and then there's the fish that feed on the zooplankton, and it could have gone right up to things like sharks, or even the very large marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs and such like.
Without sunlight, the coccoliths would have quickly died, setting in motion a chain reaction which few creatures were equipped to survive.
The plants producing fresh food died off on the land, and the phytoplankton in the oceans died off. Then it was the groups of animals that were feeding directly on those sources and weren't adaptable enough to go to other sources once they were taken away. So perhaps the herbivores, the large herbivores like the dinosaurs, which probably needed fresh foliage to support them. In the oceans, certainly there are organisms that need fresh plankton and wouldn't be able to survive, just scavenging other kinds of food.
When the dust settled and the air cleared, the dormant plant seeds could germinate in soil made fertile by the remains of the now extinct giants. The omnivorous mammals could emerge into a land free of predators. And in the water, the sharks inherited a world left empty by specialised reptile hunters who had suddenly found themselves with nothing to hunt. The impact which destroyed the dinosaurs turned out to be a massive boon to the sharks.
An awful lot of big sharks just made it straight through the boundary without apparently noticing at all. Sharks are opportunists. They will fill a niche very, very quickly because they can eat more or less anything. As I said, it's only those that have one particular food source that don't make it.
Once again, the sharks were back at the top of the food chain. And when the next large animal started to enter the water, they were ready.
The secondary occupation of the seas by mammals, in the form of whales particularly and seals, meant a certain amount of competition for food, but also a food source in themselves. In order to process a whale carcass, do enough damage to disable it, it requires very efficient biting mechanisms and very efficient teeth.
The first whales were impressive predators in their own right. But mammals are warm-blooded. The need to maintain their body temperature meant that these new sea creatures were protected by a thick layer of blubber.
Blubber is essentially made of fat, and fat is a very high nutrient food. It has something like twice the number of calories as any other foodstuffs. So of course, to any predator, Blubber is a particularly important food source because it can produce twice as much nutrient, twice as much energy as eating, for example, protein-rich mussel would.
Over the previous few million years, sharks had already begun to grow in size. Already they'd reached the size of the modern great white. But this was not enough. In order to make use of this new superfood, the sharks needed to be able to take on much larger prey.
Over that period, we see the change from a moderately big ocean-going shark to this. This is a nasty old shark. This came from Kazakhstan. It's basically the same shark as I showed you earlier, but it's developed serrations, and this allows it to slice through blubber fairly effectively. It's the only thing, this sort of serration, the only explanation we can give this serration and its success, because these made most of the other large potentially mammal-eating sharks become extinct, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. This is a big tooth. This must have been, I would think, about 50 to 60 feet long, this shark. Absolutely massive. Probably not an agile predator, probably a scavenger, because when you're as big as this, when you're the size of a small submarine, the chances of turning on a dime and chasing something are somewhat limited. It probably had a 500-metre stopping distance.
This is Megalodon, the largest predatory shark ever to have lived. It could have swallowed a great white whole. Its sheer size ensured that it would have been able to feed on just about whatever it wanted. Apart from its huge teeth, Megalodon has left scientists with very little to go on, and it's often been compared to an oversized great white. But many researchers today think such comparisons are just plain wrong.
If you increase the length of a shark 4 times, you'll get 64 times more lift from the liver in it. So in order to avoid that, then I think you have to reconstruct it as rather longer and thinner.
It's likely that Megalodon was more closely related to sand sharks and would have had a completely different approach to feeding.
Great whites have to come up underneath a dolphin or a porpoise. They have to attack from a particular angle, probably because they can't, so they're not seen, and because they move pretty fast, but so they can hit their underbelly. But Megalodon didn't have an attack strategy, probably didn't need one, because when you've got a fairly robust tooth, it doesn't matter from which angle you attack anything, you can crunch your way through it. There is another interpretation of that though, and that is the thing wasn't alive when it attacked it in the first place, so it was just rolling around in the surf. If you've seen killer whales attacking penguins on ice floes, they can come right up. There's no reason to assume that this couldn't have done something fairly similar and at least been in sort of 1 or 2 metre water where whale strandings are pretty common. It was a coastal shark, and it could probably hunt within a matter of sort of 50, 100 metres of the shoreline, very close in. There's no reason to think otherwise. Modern great whites do just that. You know, you stand a reasonable chance of being hit in 4 feet of water.
But Megalodon was a tropical, shallow water shark. As the ice ages began and first humans were beginning to emerge, the high energy blubber which had allowed Megalodon to evolve began to work against it.
Megalodon became extinct just a few million years ago at the end of the Pliocene, and its extinction coincides really with the first of the great advances of the ice ages. This would possibly have had catastrophic effects for the Megalodon, being a tropical animal, because its food source is disappearing off into cold water for much of the year to feed.
This thing couldn't live on sardines. Once its prey animal had gone, that was its lot.
And a good job too.
Columbus probably wouldn't have made it across the Atlantic if these things had been out there. At least I wouldn't have volunteered.
Sharks have survived mass extinctions in the past, but today they're facing another extinction event. Every bit as devastating as the meteor which killed off the dinosaurs. More sudden than the Permian extinction. This time it's man-made. And the cause? Soup.
And we're talking about a massive industrial process. We're talking about the Chinese economic miracle, which means that a lot more Chinamen can afford luxury foods now than they could 10 or 15 years ago. So the market's expanding very rapidly. Expanding markets have to be satisfied. You know, these fins are sort of marine gold dust almost. And it's a huge waste because most of the animal is not used at all. So it's a massive waste of a resource. But even the fin itself is not wholly used. What's used is this fibrous mat. I don't know whether you can see it on camera, but there's a yellow line here, which is a fibrous mat that covers about that area of the fin. So it's not even the whole fin that's being used, it's just that part there. That is a dorsal fin from a blue shark. When I said marine gold dust, I know of a restaurant in Mayfair in London where shark's fin soup is selling at £108 a bowl.
When Richard Pearce went looking for evidence of shark numbers in the Adriatic, he expected to discover that there had been a sharp drop. When he arrived, what he found shocked even him.
My wife and I put together quite a large-scale research project in the Adriatic, which had two objectives. One objective was to see how many sharks we could see of the 26, 27 species that are supposed to be present in those waters. And the second objective, we really hoped to run across a great white and to deploy a pop-off archival satellite tag on the animal. There was evidence that the Adriatic was recovering from having been a vastly polluted, overfished piece of water. I was hoping we would come across a great white. I was expecting we would find relatively healthy numbers of blue sharks, certainly have several encounters a day. I was hoping we would see a poor beagle or two, a mako or two, a thresher or two. We worked round the clock for 3 weeks with 2 teams, and so I think it was as good a job as ever been done before, the only job like it that's been done in recent times. And we discovered effectively a marine desert. It took 7 days for the first shark to rock up. I can go out off my home in Cornwall and we'll have a shark within an hour or 2.
And the effects on the ecology of the oceans can extend far beyond the sharks themselves.
The result of this, I think, is potentially unhealthy oceans. Sharks are the apex predator. And if you remove the top link in the ocean food chain, potentially you start to get unhealthy oceans.
What we're doing at the moment is we're taking out the specialists. We're taking out the large herbivores. We're taking out the alpha predators, you know, the very rare top predators. But the generalists are still there. The algae are still in the oceans. The grass is surviving quite well and will survive, I think, almost anything we can throw at it. But we'll lose an immense amount of diversity. So it's in many ways it's the opposite to what happened at the mass extinction events, where the base of the food chain was taken out. I think what's happening at the moment is the top of the food chain is being taken out and we're working our way down.
An example I love is of a fishery, I think it was in Hawaii, and there was a reef that was fished out. All the sharks were fished off the reef, although all the sharks were removed in one way or another. And the first thing they noticed is that the octopus population really exploded and the crustacean population disappeared. So you can see exactly what had happened when you remove the top link in that particular food chain. The sharks used to prey on the octopuses who used to eat the crustaceans. So, and then of course the octopuses died out because they had nothing to eat either. And of course the octopus and the crustaceans are part of their own food chains. So take the top link out and it all comes crashing down.
What we'll end up with is, I mean, in the oceans, algae which produces slime is is going to increase. We're going to lose the beautiful coral reefs with its high diversity faunas. And on the land, I think we'll see the same. The generalists, the rodents and things like that will be fine, but the large mammals, perhaps even the large reptiles, will really struggle, I think.
I think some of the best research was probably the research conducted by Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia in Canada. And they looked at West Atlantic fisheries figures over a 15-year period. And that's a pretty big sample of time to take. And they've discovered depletion rates based on what has happened to fishery takes over 15 years in the Western Atlantic. This indicates the blue shark, for example, is down at 60-something%. The oceanic whitetip and the white shark, the great white shark, their depletion rate was 70-something%. The thresher, I think it was, that was in the late 80s. So these are, if an animal is 89% depleted, it's 11% off extinction.
It's estimated that up to 100 million sharks per year are killed for shark's fin soup. And although it's the Chinese markets that are driving the industry, it's European fishermen who are doing much of the hunting.
Well, what we mustn't do is to confuse the consumer with the supplier. And I'm ashamed to say, actually, that the biggest supplier of fins to the Southeast Asian shark fin market is the European Union. It's us. It's not actually Britain, where I'm speaking from. It's the Spanish. The Spanish are the biggest suppliers of fins amongst the European nations, and Europe as a whole is the biggest supplier of shark fins to the Southeast Asian fin market.
The sharks were so successful because their elementary body plan, let's call it their anatomy, their streamlined body shape, their mobile jaws, their potential of developing powerful jaws with lots of teeth, their flexibility in their skeleton, their maneuverability, their excellent senses as well. This all together make them top predators. Today, all sharks we know are predators, and one has to assume that the great majority of fossil sharks were predators as well.
Sharks are amongst the most ancient creatures on Earth. Their body plan evolved almost 500 million years ago, and yet it remains almost unchanged today. They have survived the largest volcano the Earth has ever known, the impact of a meteor which wiped out the majority of life on Earth, and they have thrived in every environment in every ocean in the history of the planet. But today their numbers are plummeting out of control. In a very few years, without urgent fishing restrictions, one of evolution's greatest survivors will be wiped out forever.
I don't think in the whole history of man's abuse of animals we've ever killed quite so many of one species. That's the first thing. The second thing is we've never before chopped their body parts off, often while they're still alive. If we wanted a tiger skin or an elephant's tusk or whatever we wanted, we killed the animal first. With sharks, an awful lot of them have their fins hacked off while they're still alive, and the bodies are cast back into the sea because it's an industrial fishing process and we can't be bothered to kill them. We just take off the valuable bit. So it's not just a massive killing going on, it's just a hugely cruel process in many cases as well. And it really does need bringing to light, because we have nothing to be proud of with regard to sharks at all.